This week, Reverend Wendy continues her series, Fearlessness in Difficult Times. This series is based on the book, The Places That Scare You, by Pema Chödrön. This week, Reverend Wendy talks about cultivating loving kindness and compassion. Part of what is discussed is that cultivating loving kindness sometimes has to include feeling the fear beneath our anger and defensiveness.
Thank you, Shana and Soul Notes, man. Boy, sometimes there's a whole sermon in a song. Would you not agree? Yeah. And guess what the topic is this morning? Loving kindness, cultivating loving kindness and compassion. Cultivating loving kindness and compassion. If you weren't with us last Sunday we began a series that is based in part on a book written by Pema Chödrön. The name of the book is The Places That Scare You. The Places That Scare You. And it's about the internal places, the internal experiences that scare us, that we're going to be exploring together. And Pema Chödrön is an American Tibetan Buddhist nun, written a lot of books, a leader, spiritual director of Gampo Abbey in Nova Scotia. Somebody whose wisdom and writing, and when I've watched her on video, she really speaks to me. She speaks to me with the practicality of her spiritual path and teachings. And so I hope to impart some of her wisdom mixed with some of my own experience in this series. And today's focus, as I've said, is on cultivating loving kindness and compassion. And I'm reminded of something that His Holiness the Dalai Lama spoke about in terms of what each of these qualities is about. That compassion is the desire to help alleviate the suffering of others. It's about alleviating the suffering of others. And that loving kindness is then about not only alleviating the suffering, but wishing for, praying for, helping to bring forth happiness and blessing for the others. So one is about kind of healing the suffering and the hurt, and the other is seeing that replaced with something good, something beautiful, something beneficial. Why is it important to cultivate loving kindness and compassion? Why is it important to cultivate that not only in our families, but to stand for that and in that as a people, as a country, as a human family? I'm disliking the word human race. Race to me is about competition, and family is about something else. But why is it important to cultivate it? I think it's important to cultivate it because truly it is the only way that we will be able to create a peaceful, loving, humane, and just society and world for all of us that leaves no one and nothing behind. Mahatma Gandhi said that peace between countries is dependent upon and built upon the foundation of love between individuals. Built upon the foundation of love between individuals. You've heard me say before that you cannot legislate love. We can set up rules and laws to make for supposedly a more civil society. But true civility, true beloved community, to use the phrase that Martin Luther King used, comes about from the inside out by the kinds of qualities that each of us individually choose to cultivate, not only within our own small circle of family and friends, but that we are willing to look at in ever-widening circles. How do I roll that out? How do I keep expanding that? Pema Chödrön wrote, "Our personal attempts to live humanely in this world are never wasted. Choosing to cultivate love rather than anger just might be what it takes to save the planet from extinction." That's a pretty bold statement, and I think there's a tremendous amount of truth to that. Choosing to cultivate love rather than anger just might be what it takes to save the planet from extinction. There's some key words in there. I think the word choosing is a key word, because you and I, perhaps the single most important power that we have is our power to choose. We don't always exercise it consciously, and that's a great loss. But each and every one of us has the power to choose in any moment, to choose whether our response to a person or a situation is going to come from the emotion of fear or anger or bitterness, or whether it's going to come from feelings of loving kindness, feelings of compassion, the desire to at least understand. You know, while we're working at making America great again, and some of us don't believe it ever wasn't great, but while we're working at making America great again, could we not stand together in solidarity toward making America kinder again? Kinder. Kindness is not a political statement. It ought to be, it needs to be a deeply held and lived out human value. Let us be a kinder people. I actually do not think we can be great as an individual person or as a country without being kind. To me, greatness absolutely requires kindness as well. It's very much that beautiful Buddhist, what I see to be the two pillars of Buddhism, the balance of wisdom and compassion. The balance of those two things in us individually and then in us collectively. So there are 4 ideas that I want to share with you this morning, pulling from Pema's work, The Places That Scare You. And I'll end with a specific kind of meditation practice that I think embodies the idea of cultivating loving kindness and compassion. The first idea in this cultivation of loving kindness and compassion has to do with what happens when we harden our heart against anyone. When we harden our heart against anyone, we ultimately hurt ourselves. When we harden our heart against anyone, we ultimately hurt ourselves. It takes courage to stay open and not to shut down, especially living in times like we're living in today, where there seems to be one frightening situation happening right after another, that we barely get our emotional, spiritual bearings before there seems to be something else that knocks us off center. And so on one hand, it's very understandable, this tendency to shut down, and yet we can't afford to do that. As a human family, we must not harden our heart against anyone, because not only are we hurting ourselves, but we are prolonging the pain and suffering in the world. Loving kindness is about a gesture of compassion that says, I want to remain sensitive to and aware of the cries of the world. I want to remain sensitive to and aware of the cries of the world. There is a lot of suffering and hurt going on in the world all around us. We cannot allow ourselves to shut down around it. We need to keep ourselves open and aware of it. Some cries for help are skillful, and many cries for help are not skillful. The fact that the cries for help are not skillful must not be the reason we choose to shut down. You know, there's the question, am I my brother's keeper? My answer to that statement or that question is no. I am not my brother's keeper. I am my brother. Big difference. Big difference. To look at just being my brother's keeper is very different than what happens when I realize I am my brother. When I come from the place of am I brother's keeper, I may do all sorts of loving and kind and good things, and I don't ever want to suggest we stop that. But an even deeper practice, an even deeper spiritual practice and a broader awakening is when I realize it's more than being my brother's keeper. I am my brother. That's what it means to be aware of the cries of the world, to be aware of the hurt, and to be willing to be a vehicle to be used to do whatever we can do to make a difference. No one expects any single person to do it all. But if we shut down, we won't do the part that is ours to do. And the part that is ours to do may simply be things like I talked about last week. When we see someone that we know is being marginalized, whether it's because of their sexuality, because of the color of their skin, because of the religion that they practice, we refuse to remain silent in the presence of that. We speak not from a place of anger, but from the awareness that we are in this together, from the awareness that we are part of the same fabric of divinity expressing itself uniquely. And we do not let those kinds of wrongs happen around us without us at least being a part of the solution by speaking a word of truth, a word of kindness, a word of compassion in the midst of the situation. And it doesn't matter if it doesn't change what's happening right then and there. It doesn't matter if it doesn't change what's happening right then and there. We have at the very least planted a seed. And if we are sincere in our belief of the power of our words in metaphysics and the power of our intention, then we know that at least we are doing something that over time is going to expand until there is a new mental, emotional, and spiritual meme that becomes operative in the planet. Do you believe that there can be a time, a place in human evolution, conscious evolution, where the idea of killing one another to solve our problems is like, what in the world? Do you believe that? I believe we can get there. I really do. And I'm not so naive to discount the work before us to do it, and that it's not somebody else's work. It's my work, it's your work, it's a person next to you, behind you. It really is our work together. Second point, pulling from the places that scare you. Pema writes, to cultivate loving kindness, we must first be honest, loving, and compassionate toward ourselves. To cultivate loving kindness in the world around us, in our communities, in our country, to do that, we have to first be honest, loving, and compassionate toward ourselves. Simple question I want to ask you is to think of the last time that you made a really dumb mistake. Can you think of last time? And if you're here with a partner, no elbow poking, okay? What was your private self-talk like? Yeah, I see. That is just what I'm talking about, Julia, right? You know, that's not very... Would you do that to a toddler learning to walk that made a mistake and fumbled? Some of us grew up with either external voices that it's usually external voices that we've internalized, that when we make a mistake, we are so harsh on ourselves and we speak so unkindly to ourselves with such shaming and humiliating and blaming. And how does that leave us feeling? Doesn't leave us feeling very empowered to do better the next time. So a piece of cultivating loving kindness that we can share with others is built upon us practicing it within ourselves as well. Being more gentle and kind with ourselves when we make mistakes, because we're going to make them, and we're going to make a lot of them, and we'll keep making them. And if we're growing, we're going to make bigger ones in more important ways, but we're also going to potentially be making a bigger, stronger, more positive difference. So looking at that inner voice and learning how to treat yourself and speak to yourself personally with compassion and loving kindness. And if you don't know what that sounds like, try to imagine the person in your life that you would call your best friend. How would they be talking to you? And if there is a gap between how you talk to yourself and how they would, that gap is part of your homework assignment. You know, Jesus gave several very powerful, brief, important teachings on love. And one of them was his teaching that we were to love our neighbor Okay, as ourself. Some people live that statement out as if the word as was the word instead. We must not do that. He didn't say, love your neighbor instead of yourself. He said, love your neighbor as yourself. So that's a practice point in our ability to cultivate our capacity for loving kindness and compassion toward others. A third is to cultivate third part of cultivating loving kindness is the willingness to look beneath our emotions of anger and fear. Or actually to look beneath our emotion of anger and defensiveness, because underneath anger and defensiveness, we're going to find an experience of fear. And the fear is usually triggered because we are afraid of some sort of loss. It might be a physical loss. It might be an emotional loss, a loss of esteem, a loss of a certain way of living, a loss of freedom. And so if we are willing to begin to peel back more and more of these layers, we will begin to discover what it is that's moving in us so that we can we can continue to do the deeper work of healing. What's the expression? Only hurting people hurt others. And so we want to make sure that we understand what's going on inside of us. When we feel triggered to anger, when we suddenly feel that emotion of defensiveness coming up, and heaven knows there's a lot happening, would you not agree, in our world today that you can get downright angry. Anybody feeling a little more angry lately than you have in the last, we won't even say when, but you know that I'm feeling a lot more anger than I used to feel about an awful lot of things. And there is a piece of anger that can be positive in terms of motivating us to action. There's the whole adrenaline experience of anger. And staying in a place of anger is a toxic place to be. And the energy with which we try to bring about change in the world, really for the change to be a positive, lasting, deep change, must not be coming primarily from the place of anger or fear. It really needs to come from a place of love and compassion. And that is deep, deep work. The fourth is training. We train in opening our hearts and minds in increasingly difficult situations. We train. I like the word train that Pema uses. It's used quite a bit in Buddhism. We train in opening our hearts and minds in ever-widening circles. Let me read some of her thoughts on this. Difficult relationships. Anybody have a difficult relationship? Anybody have more than one difficult relationship now? Difficult relationships are in many ways the most valuable for practice. The people who irritate us are the ones who inevitably blow our cover. Through them, we might come to see our defenses more clearly. The people who irritate us are the ones who inevitably blow our cover. If you're taking notes, whether on your device or on an old-fashioned piece of paper, I'd like to suggest you write this down as a question. Who keeps blowing my cover? Because that's a homework place. Who keeps blowing my cover? Shantideva, an 8th century Buddhist monk. Now think about this. 8th century Buddhist monk. And what I'm going to read to you in terms of what he suggests. 8th century, people were still working on this. And we're still working on this today. He writes, if we wish to practice generosity and a beggar arrives, that's good news. The beggar gives us an opportunity to learn how to give. Likewise, if we want to practice patience and unconditional loving kindness and an enemy arrives, we're in luck. Have you ever felt that way? Oh, I'm in luck. I don't think that's the first thing we usually say or think. Oh, I'm in luck. Without the ones who irritate us, we never have a chance to practice. Some of us have many more chances to practice, it seems, than others. And I have a little theory about that. It must be that God just trusts you so much and believes so much in your capacity for growth in love and kindness and compassion, that God, He, She, its Spirit would give you so many people to blow your cover and give you the opportunity to train and to practice. And have you noticed how sometimes some of them wind up in your family? Isn't that, see, it's almost like you can't get away from them. I mean, you can, but the price to get away from somebody in your family, mentally or emotionally, usually is a different price tag, is it not? Than just that person. You can say, I'm never going to let my path cross them again. But this whole approach would say, no, we lean into it. We lean into it and we see that whenever unhealthy emotions are getting triggered in us, that we are willing to lean in and ask ourselves a deeper question, what's getting triggered in me, and where is my cover being blown, and what do I need to move into a different response to what I see? It doesn't mean that we ever stay in a situation that is physically harmful to us, not that at all, but it is a willingness to stay and to look at the other that is irritating, that seems to be blowing our cover, as a blessed being in our lives to help us transcend and move beyond that kind of reaction and experience. You've heard me use the expression sandpaper to our soul for people that are those ones that get under our skin. Pema writes a story, and I'm going to read it to you. It's a very brief story, and uses a different phrase for this, and I'm coming to really like this phrase. And so I'll lead into the story with this question. Who is your Bengali tea boy? Who is your Bengali tea boy? Before Atisha, and Atisha was a teacher who helped to spread a certain form of Buddhism, I can't get it out right now, in the 11th century. Anyway, before Atisha brought the Bodhisattva practices from India to Tibet, he was told that the people in Tibet were universally cheerful and kind. He was afraid that if that was the case, he'd have no one to provoke him and show him where he needed to train. So he chose to bring along the most difficult person in his life, his Bengali tea boy, who was as skillful at showing him his faults as his guru. The joke is that he really didn't need that Bengali servant because there are plenty of irritating people in Tibet too. You can clap for that. I think it's a poignant little story. So who is your Bengali tea boy? And even more did you catch in this little story that he chose to bring him along. He didn't say, oh my God, I'm leaving so I can leave this guy back here. He chose to bring him along. Would that be a shift in your energy? Yeah, the room just went very quiet. Mine too, but at least we're willing to look at that, right? And it's in looking at that that we can begin to cultivate much more loving kindness and compassion for ourselves and for others. I have a very strong recommendation, and that is you do not start with your heaviest relationship. You start with the simplest one. Don't worry about whether forgiving everyone in the world means you have to forgive Hitler today if you have not forgiven your mother yet. If you haven't forgiven your mother, and your mother is still your Bengali tea boy, start looking at that relationship before you go into the next layer out. Does that make sense? That was a very weak yes. I hope the soul yes was stronger than the human verbal yes. And then the last piece is a simple meditation practice that I'm going to close with. And you can look this up further if you're interested in it. It's a practice that I personally use pretty frequently. It's called Tonglen Meditation, Tonglen. Raise your hand if you know what Tonglen Meditation is. Just a few of you. Tonglen Meditation is a Tibetan, it comes from the Tibetan words that mean sending and receiving. And so the idea of Tonglen Meditation is the willingness to be sensitive to where others are hurting. It can be another individual, or it could be a whole group of people, but being sensitive and aware to where others are hurting, and being willing to breathe in that hurt, to consciously breathe that in a meditative state, and then to breathe out the desire for the relief of that suffering and for a blessing to come in its place. It's a beautiful practice to do on many different levels. It can certainly be done during formal meditation time when you're sitting, as the Buddhists call it, sitting on the cushion. Or it can simply be done in the moment when you see someone or something that is hurting, whether it's a physical hurt or an emotional hurt or some form of unkindness or injustice, is to be aware of, to keep the heart open, sensitive to that, to breathe that in. You don't keep it. That's not healthy. But to breathe that in as if you are taking some of that suffering, taking some of that sadness, some of that pain away from the person into yourself, and then transforming it by sending out the feeling of love, the feeling of kindness, the feeling of compassion. One of the ways it can also be used is, say, for example, you personally are going through a difficult situation in your life. Maybe you're going through a breakup of a relationship, or you're dealing with a serious financial matter, or you're dealing with some ailment in your body. You might breathe the awareness of that particular situation in with the desire to relieve your own suffering, and then you breathe that out with the desire for compassion, desire for relief. But then you also take it to the next step with the willingness to think about anybody else, the entire human family that's going through the same thing that you're going through right now. That divorce, that financial situation, that child that's troubled, whatever it may be, and that you're connecting yourself compassionately to others like you that are experiencing the same thing. It's one of the ways that we help to expand our own personal capacity toward love and toward kindness. It is the way that we can keep the hardness that is so easy to have develop around our heart in times like these, to soften that, to keep ourselves open, that we might truly live in the awareness, we are not our brother's keeper, we are our brother. Let us keep that in our minds and hearts and be vigilant about what is ours to practice right where we are. And I promise you that the moment you're willing to practice right where you are, you will have no shortage of opportunities to do so. Namaste.
Thanks for listening. Sunday services at 9 and 11 a.m. Inclusivity. It's worth the drive. Subscribe to our podcasts and download our free app for instant access to a wealth of spiritual teachings, services, and events.